Hi, I'm Ann Coulter. Welcome to my Substack. I have one of my favorite people in the world today, the City Journal's John Tierney, who used to be the only reason to read the New York Times for the science section for a million years. And I particularly wanted to have John on today because I think my misogyny reached its lowest level after the last election, when I was so proud of my gender. They didn't turn an election to save the country into an election about abortion. So I thought, oh, yeah, the gals are learning. And now we've had all the Tesla protests, rulings from Amy Coney Barrett. I was always against her. And I remembered this wonderful article John Tierney had written on the misogyny myth. So welcome, John Tierney.
Thanks for having me, Ann. It's great to be here.
What was so great about that article, I think most sane people realize that all of this misogyny and the wage gap and blah, 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 was sort of feminist nonsense. But you just went through study after study after study, and you have one paragraph, it's just all of the ways women are better off than women in how long they live and how much they collect in government welfare versus how much they pay in taxes. Women are more likely to initiate divorce. They're more likely to get custody. Anyway, it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, I was surprised when I really dug into it, just how many advantages, and just there are these psychological studies too, that both sexes are much more care much more about women. They have much, even the implicit bias, these tests where you look at which is kind of, stupid anyway, but it's always used to say there's implicit racism, but there's implicit sexism, because both sexes of all social classes and ages are, much more, much quicker to associate negative things with men. That's just the way people are. And men are just as bad as women practically on this.
No, it's very sweet and chivalrous. Describe that study in Australia. I loved not only the results of the study, but in particular, the conclusion they came to, despite in the face of the evidence.
It was a study where the Australian civil service had 59% were women. And of course, that was fine. There was no problem with that gender imbalance. But only 49% of the executives were of women. So they had to redress this. They had a whole, and they brought in this Harvard team of behavioral economists, and they decided to use the same technique as in the famous Orcas Study, where, the women do better in blind auditions. And we can get into that. That was also bogus, but they still believe the results of that. So they did this huge experiment. I think 2,000, managers who were given, this list of people to hire, and who would you shortlist? And some of the names would have a name like Wendy Richards. Some would have the same resume with Gary Richards, and some would have no name at all. And to the horror of the researchers, it turned out that having Wendy Richards was more likely to be shortlisted than Gary Richards. And it was a big advantage to be a woman, in other words. And so their conclusion, it was obvious there was rampant sexism in the Australian civil service, but their conclusion was, well, we can't do gender blind hiring. We have to look for other ways to discriminate against women. It was so blatant.
Yes. And they did this. I didn't know that. Until I read your article, I guess 2 years ago. The Orcas study gets cited all the time to this day, and I find out from you, it turns out it was a crock.
Right. It was done, about in 2000, I think. And it's been cited over and over. It's always, at every diversity conference, this is where, why women have to be twice as good as men. That when there were blind auditions, the women did better. And then in 2019, a couple of people outside the diversity industry, it was a statistician at Columbia, I think, and someone else, just took another look at it. And they realized that overall, the women did worse in blind auditions. And they're actually in the paper. But it wasn't in the, in the summary, so no one paid any attention to it. And that they had come up with this really weaselly conclusion that if you looked at a certain subset of women, they did better, not all the time, but sometimes. And the results were not statistically significant, but they still put the conclusion in, yes, women are blah, blah, blah. And so, and the authors didn't deny this, but yet it's still, and even after this was exposed, Christina Hoff Sommers, who does great work on this topic, she wrote about it for the Wall Street Journal. It is being cited more than ever today. There was an interesting guy, Lee Jussum, who is at Rutgers, who he has surveyed the literature on, the literature on sex bias, and he finds that studies that find a bias against women tend to be very small studies, fewer than 200 people. And the ones that find no bias or bias in favor of women tend to be huge, like more than 2,000 people. So those should count more. But in fact, the small studies, the small flawed studies about the women bias, they get cited 5 times more often. It's just the same, Like this Australian study, nobody's going to cite this, showing that women were favored. It's just that the journalists don't write about it. So, I mean, it really is such a scandal, and it's been going on for decades. So.
Now, they do a lot of the similar kinds of studies to prove that we're all racist. I assume those come out the same way, or have you looked at those?
Well, even the racist stuff is very, it's sort of iffy. Some studies show that, if you show a black face, and they have this technique, you have to associate it with a positive or negative attribute.
Oh, yeah.
And it's an instantaneous thing. And I mean, it's really, I mean, the whole field, I think, is not, I mean, there are people who just say the whole thing is nonsense because there's no correlation between people who supposedly have this implicit bias against blacks and their behavior. No one's ever shown that. It's just something like that. But the study that I saw was really the best one done yet because it didn't just use college students like so many of these students did. They got a nationally representative sample of adults, a big sample, and they showed them pictures, not just a headshot, often like a black and white headshot. They showed color photos of people dressed in lots of different clothes. They're different ages, and they wanted to see who was biased, and there was no bias by age, by race, among any of the groups in it. There was a slight bias, people who were wearing hoodies and T-shirts, there was a slight bias against them versus people who were dressed in blazers and business suits. But the biggest bias by far was that everybody, men and women of all ages, all races, all social classes, were quicker to associate negative attributes with men and positive attributes with women. I mean, everybody's unconsciously biased against women if you believe that theory. They're biased in favor of women.
Do you think that's because of the last, 40 years of male bashing from the universities, from the media? We hear about toxic masculinity and testosterone poisoning and the gender gap and blah, 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 blah.
You can watch complete episodes of Unsafe with Ann Coulter by subscribing to AnnCoulter.substack.com. That's AnnCoulter.substack.com. You can also listen to complete episodes for free at Ricochet.com. Choose Unsafe from the pull-down menu at the top of the page. That's Ricochet.com, your home for civil center right conversation on the web.